Abhimanyu Mishra is back at it, and now he is only 8 points away from getting the rating he needs to become a Grandmaster. He still needs one more norm, and he has until September 5th to get it. So he's doing very, very well. We'll call Abhimanyu Mishra Abhi for short. In our game today, he's playing the white pieces against a Grandmaster named Zoltan Varga. It begins with d4. Abhi has white. d5, c4, c6, the Slav. Knight c3, knight f6. e3, e6, the semi-Slav. And this is the beginning of the Moran variation of the semi-Slav, a very, very popular opening, especially at the highest levels of the game. Knight f3, knight b to d7. White plays bishop to e2. Now, the normal move here is bishop to d3, but when you play that, if black takes on c4, white is forced to recapture because the pawn at c4 is threatening the bishop. When you play the bishop to e2 and black takes on c4, as he does in the game, white has options. He doesn't necessarily have to take the pawn, and Abhi doesn't. Abhi plays a4, controlling the b5 square, which makes it so that black can't defend that pawn by playing b5. Bishop to d6, the standard move in the semi-Slav Moran for black, but it allows a maneuver for white. He can take the knight at f3, go to d2, and take the pawn with the knight, and hit that bishop at d6. That d6 square is going to be very sensitive throughout the game. Knight d2 beginning that maneuver. Black plays e5, and anyone who's seen my video on how to handle Slav structures knows that this is the primary pawn break that black has available to him in the Slav. Knight takes c4, hitting that bishop. An interesting side note, in our previous game with Abhi, a French defense, the line was covered directly in a chessable course by Anish Giri. In this game, this line also covered directly in a chessable course, this time by Sam Shanklin. So if you want to prepare for Abhimanyu, maybe checking out chessable would be advised. Hitting that bishop, so the bishop tucks back away on c7. b3 protects the knight at c4, but also allows that c1 bishop to go to a3, a really strong diagonal. That a3, f8 diagonal will keep black from, controlling that diagonal will keep black from castling. ed4, black could castle here, but then bishop a3, rook a8, castles. ed4, queen e4, knight e5, knight goes into d6. That knight keeps going into d6 in a lot of these variations, and it's a real pest for black in that position. You'd have to take it and give up the two bishops. So instead, black takes on d4. Queen takes d4, knight to b6. So the pressure on that d6 square, you have the knight at c4, the queen at d4, the bishop at c1 is heading to a3, everything sort of targeting d6. To relieve the pressure, black plays knight to b6 to offer an exchange of queens to try to relieve the pressure. And by the way, if you feel you're getting value from this video, be sure to like and subscribe and click the bell notification to be made aware of future videos. White captures on d8, goes ahead and exchanges queens. Black takes with the king. He could take with the bishop, but if he does, again, knight to d6 check, that irritating square, king f8, bishop to a3, and white has a superior position. So he takes with the king. The bishop goes to a3, as we've anticipated. Bishop to e6, and again, knight does drop into the d6 square. The knight simply cannot be tolerated. It's just too strong there. So black goes ahead and chops it off. Bishop takes knight, bishop takes bishop. And you'll see white now has the advantage of the two bishops. He has an unopposed dark squared bishop and a very strong position. Bishop takes b3, rook to b1. The bishop goes back to e6. If he grabs that pawn, then white just takes it with the knight. Knight takes, and then rook to b7, and the rook penetrates into black's position. So he retreats to e6. a5, kicking that knight away. Again, aiming that rook at b1 at the pawn at b7. The knight goes back to c8, targeting the bishop on d6. Bishop to e5. He plays knight to d7, and allowing the bishop to take on g7, but he's saying, well, I'll just play rook to g8, and when that bishop moves, I'll take the pawn at g2. But white plays the bishop back to f4, a very powerful move. It controls an important diagonal, and it threatens to come back to g3 and trap the rook at g2. So he's got to get the rook out. Rook goes back to g8. Now rook to b7. Knight to c5. Now, we talk about the initiative. That means you don't respond to your opponent's threats, but instead you try to create threats yourself. Well, Abhi doesn't get the rook out. He plays a6. Backs up that rook, and if the knight were to take the rook, pawn takes knight, forking the rook and the knight, and also controlling that b8 square would be curtains, so he can't take the rook. Knight to b6, bishop to d6, threatening the knight on c5. Then the knight goes to d7, defending the knight at c5. Rook to c7, attacking the pawn at c6. Every little move has a threat. Every single move has a little threat attached to it. Knight to b8, defending the c6 pawn. King to d2, beginning to activate his king. Now he wants to take the pawn at a6, but in order to do that, he would relax the defense of the c6 pawn. So he defends the c6 pawn with the bishop. If he took the pawn, say knight ca6, rook to b7, king c8, rook e7, king d8, knight e4, and that knight on e4 is very powerful. It can go to the f6 square, among other squares. So bishop goes back to d7 to defend the c6 pawn. Rook to b7. He can't take that rook still because pawn takes knight would be devastating. Knight takes pawn. Bishop takes a6. Knight takes a6. e4. And the idea is to play the pawn to e5, sort of anchor that bishop, screw it into that d6 square, and then come in with the knight behind the pawn to e4, like an octopus controlling all those squares. King c8, rook hb1. Now he's doubled the rooks on the open b file. The knight at a6 has nowhere to go. Literally, it's stuck on that square. There's nowhere square it can move and not be captured. Bishop to e6, e5, continuing the plan. Rook to d8. Now he goes knight to a4. Perhaps a better move would have been king to e3. After knight a4, white is still a bit better, but black can fight on. Rook to d7. He wants to trade off that rook at b7 and relax the pressure. White says, no way. Abhi retreats the rook. He wants to keep that pressure going. Bishop to f5, targeting that rook on b1. But this move is a mistake because now white can play rook to c1, targeting that c6 pawn, creating x-ray pressure against that rook, against that king on c8. Bishop to e4 to defend the c6 pawn. King to e3, a good move, but not the best move. The best move here looks to be knight to c3. Really powerful, some cool tactics right in this position. If black retreats the bishop to g6, white just plays knight to d5. And the pawn can't take the knight because it's pinned, and the c6 pawn is not going to be long for this world. If he plays bishop to g2, maintaining the defense of the c6 pawn, again, some really cool tactics. Rook to g1, say bishop h3, and watch this, knight to d5. And now the pawn is not pinned, and the pawn could take the knight. And if he does take the knight, rook to c2 check, and he has a few options. If he plays king to d8, rook to g8, checkmate, instant checkmate, so he can't do that. If he plays king to b7, rook to b1, check, knight b4 is forced, rook takes knight, king a6, rook to a2 is mate. So he would be forced to play knight c7, but then bishop takes c7, rook takes check, king to b7, rook takes c7, check, king takes c7, rook takes a8, and he would have a decisive material advantage. So knight c3 was probably a bit better. King to e3 was what he played. Bishop d5, trying to continue to defend c6. f4. And the threat at this point is the knight coming back to c3 and crushing that bishop. And he goes ahead and takes the bishop with his rook. He just sees that bishop as an intolerable piece. The pressure is just too great. Computers recommend rook d6 here also. Pawn takes, and he's going to try to recover that d6 pawn and say, I'm down in exchange, but I've got 2 pawns for it, so I live to fight another day. King d7, knight c3, rook e8 check, king d2, king takes d6, so he gets his second pawn, but then knight takes d5, pawn takes knight, rook b to c2. Now he's threatening rook to c6 check, which would allow him to take that a6 knight. Knight to b4 to control the c6 square and gain a tempo against the rook at c2. Rook c7, a double attack. The a7 pawn and the f7 pawn. a5, he says, well, the pawn on the side of the board, the a file is going to be harder to stop, so I'll give up the f7 pawn. d4, rook f6 check. Black plays king to d7. King to d5 was probably a little bit better after rook f5 check, king e4, rook takes a5, knight to d3. He's still fighting. White is better, but black is still in the game. But after king to d7, rook to c5, hitting that a pawn, rook to a8, defending it, rook to h5, and black actually resigned in this position because those rooks are just way too powerful. They sort of have that stair-step threat that could be mate or win the rook at a8. The rooks are just way too powerful here. And black resigned. So Abhimanyu Mishra has another good event. He did not get his norm, but he made some real positive rating gains. Thank you for joining us here at Chess Dog, and please subscribe and join us again. Goodbye.